Good evening. Am I audible to everyone? Selvi, good evening. Kalyan, good evening. Am I audible to everyone? What I discussed with you in the previous class? Yes, what I discussed with you in the previous class? Yes, good evening, everybody. Yes, what do you mean by an ER model? So I was discussing with you about different types of keys. What are all the different types of attributes? What do you mean by an entity? I was discussing with you about data independence, right? So what do you mean by data independence? Please respond. What do you mean by data independence? Yes, I was discussing with you about ER model. What do you mean by data independence? What are all the different types of data independence and what do you mean by an entity and what are all the other things I discussed with you in my previous class, that is yesterday. So what are all the different types of attributes? What are all the different types of attributes? Yes, good evening everybody. What are all the different types of attributes? Yes, multi-layered. So I was discussing with you about different types of attributes. Gayatri, so I'm just discussing with you about DBMS. When I'm going to discuss with you about SQL, I will just show you some practical examples, how to insert some queries, how to insert records, how to create tables. Yes, there are different types of attributes, single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute. So all these are the different types of attributes. And what do you mean by an entity set? What do you mean by a simple attribute and what do you mean by a composite attribute? What is the difference between composite and derived attribute? What is the difference between composite and derived attribute? Please respond. What is the difference between composite and derived attribute? Yes, good evening everybody. What is the difference between composite and derived attribute? Yes, physical data independence, logical data independence. And I was discussing with you about entity set. What do you mean by entity set? Yes, similar type of entities collection, it is called as an entity set. Yes, it has some atomic values. And what do you mean by a derived attribute and composite attribute? So what are all the different types of keys? What do you mean by a super key and what do you mean by a candidate key? Yes, it cannot be divided. What do you mean by a super key and what do you mean by a candidate key? What do you mean by a super key and what do you mean by a candidate key? Yes, it is derived from other attributes. For example, age is derived from the date of birth. So all those things. What do you mean by a super key? Please respond. What are all the different things I discussed with you yesterday? What do you mean by a super key? And what do you mean by a primary key? I was discussing with you about different types of keys, right? So everything is clear. What are all the different mapping cardinalities? Please respond. Can you give me an example of candidate key? Yesterday I was discussing with you about candidate keys, right? Yes, what do you mean by a candidate key? Can you give me an example of candidate key? Yes, uniquely identify a tuple. And what do you mean by a candidate key? Yes, good Rupa. So what do you mean by a candidate key? What is the difference between a candidate key and a primary key? What do you mean by a primary key? Yesterday I was discussing with you about primary key, right? What do you mean by a primary key? Can you give me some examples of primary keys? Can you give me an example of primary key? What do you mean by a primary key? Yes. So till this part, whatever I am discussing, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? I hope I am clear with my topics. Yes, license numbers. Yes, Aditya. Yes, thank you. So today I am just going to continue. So I just gave you some introduction to entity relationships. So whenever I am going to develop any database, whenever I am going to develop a database for any kind of application, so ER diagram. So what do you mean by an ER diagram? Entity relationship diagram. For example, I have different types of entities, attributes, relationship sets. So they can be represented with the help of an ER diagram. So what do you mean by an entity? They are represented by means of rectangles. For example, I have this student, teacher, projects. So they are named with the entity set they represent. For example, I have a student, I have teacher and projects. So all these are different entities. So what do you mean by entities? Entities are represented by rectangles. For example, I have a student entity, I have a teacher entity and I have a projects entity. So what do you mean by an entity? It is called as a standalone unit. For example, each and every entity, it can be represented as a table in the database. And what do you mean by attributes? So attributes, they are the properties of entities. For example, I have this student class or student entity. For example, I have name. All these are the attributes. So attributes are represented by ellipse, whereas an entity, the standalone unit or class, they are represented by rectangles. So every ellipse, they represent one attribute and it is directly connected to its entity. So I have name, date of birth, roll number. So they are just connected to this entity. Clear with this? So attributes, they provide some information. So whenever I have any entity, what do you mean by an entity? So each and every entity can be represented as a table in the database. For example, I have a student table and what are all the different fields that are present in my student table? So I have name, date of birth, roll number. So all these are the different fields that are present in my student table. So in case of attributes, I can go for, I was discussing, so composite attribute, they are further divided into a tree-like structure. So every node is then connected to its attribute. Composite attributes are represented by ellipse. Clear with this? For example, I am having student. I have this name. So first name and last name. So what do you mean by this? So from this picture, pictorially, you can just understand. What do you mean by a simple attribute and what do you mean by a composite attribute? So what do you mean by this composite attribute? For example, I have this name, first name and last name. So it can be combined into a name. So it is called as a composite attribute. So this is my student entity. I have roll number and birth date. For example, I have name. So first name and last name, they can be combined into a name attribute. So this is called as a composite attribute. And multi-valued attribute. Generally, attributes are represented by ellipse and the entities are represented in the form of rectangles. For example, I have a student table or student entity and name, date of birth and roll number. So all these are the different attributes. And in case of name, so it can be further split into first name and last name. Clear with this? So what do you mean by an entity and what do you mean by? So it is called as a composite attribute. So what do you mean by a simple attribute and what do you mean by a composite attribute? So pictorially from this picture you can just understand what do you mean by a composite attribute. So whenever I am considering this name attribute, so it is going to combine this first name and last name. Clear? So what do you mean by this composite attribute? So next I am going to discuss with you about multi-valued attributes. So multi-valued attributes, they are represented by double ellipse. So you can see here, student, it is a standalone entity. And what are the different attributes of this student table or student class? So I have the name of the student, date of birth and roll number and phone number. So a student class, it can have more than one phone number. So multi-valued attributes are represented by double ellipse. So it can contain the first name, last name. So whenever I am going for this name, so it is called as a composite attribute. Clear with this? So for example, it can have the first name and last name, whereas multi-valued attributes, they are represented by double ellipse. So phone number. So a student can have more than one phone number. Clear with this? So what are the different types of attributes? So whenever I am going to develop any kind of web application, so any kind of application, so ER diagram. So I am going to store all my entities as tables in the database. So whenever I have any student table, I am collecting in an academic institution. So I am collecting the student details. So in my front end page, in my form, what are the different fields? So I need to collect the name of the student. So what is the date of birth? What is this roll number? So whenever I am going to consider the name, it is going to combine the first name and last name. So I can call this as a composite attribute. So they are depicted by double ellipse. So whenever I am going to go for this composite attribute, they are represented by double ellipse. So I have this student table. So whatever is the date of birth and roll number. So each and every student is identified by a unique roll number. So primary key. So what are the different types of keys when I was discussing, right? So whenever I am drawing the ER diagram, so you should understand what do you mean by a primary key, what do you mean by a candidate key and what do you mean by a super key. So multi-valued attributes, they are represented by double ellipse. So what do you mean by this multi-valued? From the term you can just understand. So a person can have, so a student can have more than one phone number. And what are the other type of attributes? So the first type of attribute is the simple attribute. The second type of attribute, it is the composite attribute. And the third type of attribute is the derived attribute. So derived attribute are represented by dashed ellipse. So what do you mean by this derived attribute? From the name you can just understand what do you mean by a simple, composite, multi-valued, derived. So what do you mean by derived? I am going to derive something from my parent class. For example, from the date of birth, I can decide my age. So this is called as a derived attribute. So pictorially from this picture, you can just understand. So what are the simple attributes here? So name, that is roll number and date of birth, simple attribute. Name is a composite attribute. Age is a derived attribute and phone number is a multi-valued attribute. Clear with this? So what are the different symbols? So entity is a standalone unit. It is represented by rectangles. Whereas the name, the birth date, so you can see here, it is all these are attributes, they are represented by ellipse. And dashed line, so derived attributes are represented by dashed ellipse. And multi-valued attributes are represented by double ellipse. Clear with this? So I'm just discussing. So whenever I'm going to develop I'm going to draw a ER diagram for my database. So how I'm going to draw? So what are the different symbols used for different types of attributes? So next I'm going to discuss with you about relationship. Till this part, whatever I'm speaking, everything is clear. So next I'm going to discuss with you about relationships. So far I just gave you an outline or sketch. So whenever I'm going to draw any picture, whenever I'm going to draw any ER diagram, so firstly I should have a rectangle and what are all the different types of attributes. So next I'm going to discuss with you about relationship. So what do you mean by a relationship? They are represented by diamond shaped box. So what is the relationship between different entities? So there are many entities, rectangles participating in a relationship. They are connected to it by a line. So there are different types of relationships. So whenever I have a bigger database, in an academic institution, there can be a student table, a teacher table, and what are the other tables? Similarly, in a corporate company, so I have an employee table, I have a salesperson, admin table. In an e-commerce website, so I can have a customer table, order table, purchase table. So what is the relationship between the different tables? There are different types of relationships. So what do you mean by a relationship? So whenever two entities are participating, so it is called as a binary relationship. So I have some, for example, a student table and a teacher table. So what is the relationship between these two tables? So it is called as a binary relationship. And cardinality. So what do you mean by this term? So whenever I'm going to draw any kind of entity relationship diagram, so all these are the important terms you should understand. Basically, what do you mean by this relationship? So where two entities are participating, it is called as a binary relationship. And cardinality is the number of instances of an entity from a relation that can be associated with the relation. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this relation? How they are being related to each other? And I was discussing, right? So what are the different types of cardinalities? One to one, one to many. So you can see here, whenever I have any relationship, you can see here it is represented by a diamond shape, diamond symbol. So one to many, many to one, and many to many. So all these are the different types of relationships. So in case of many to many relationships, so far I just gave you some introduction, what do you mean by an ER diagram and what are the different types of attributes and how they are represented by different symbols. So next I'm going to discuss with you about participation constraints. So what do you mean by this participation constraint? So I can go for total participation or partial participation. So what do you mean by this total participation and what do you mean by this partial participation? So each entity is involved in the relationship. So total participation is represented by double lines, whereas partial participation, so not all entities are involved in the relationship. So partial participation is represented by single line. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this total participation and what do you mean by this partial participation? So from the name you can just understand what do you mean by this total participation and what do you mean by this partial participation. So all these are the different types of participation constraints. So what do you mean by this total participation? So each and every entity is involved in the relationship. So total participation is represented by double lines. Whereas partial participation. So not all entities are involved in the relationship. So partially I am going to involve. So from this picture you can just understand. What do you mean by this participation constraint? So I have two separate entities. So this is my first entity and second entity, and what is the relationship between two entities? So there is a relationship it is represented by diamond shape. So what do you mean by total participation? When all the entities are involved. So this is called as total participation. And what do you mean by this partial participation? So not all the entities are involved. I am going to involve only some entities are involved. It is called as partial participation. Clear with this? So all these are the important terms you should understand. So whenever you can see here, what is the relationship between this? So when all the entities are participating, they are represented by double lines. Whereas only some entities are participating, it is called as a partial participation. So what do you mean by this generalization? So far I just gave you some introduction to ER model. So what are the different types of attributes, how to draw any ER model, and how they are represented by different symbols. So next I am going to discuss with you about one more important topic. What do you mean by generalization and what do you mean by specialization? So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Constraints means, for example, I am going to apply some restrictions. So it is called as a constraint. Clear with this? Say for example, if I am going to involve all the entities, I am imposing some constraint, some limitations. So it is called as a constraint. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS-MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS-MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. So what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass. So database management system. So firstly, I just discussed with you about DBMS. So what do you mean by database management system? I was discussing with you about different concepts, and then I will be discussing with you about SQL. What do you mean by structured query language? How to create tables, insert records, delete records. And then I will be discussing with you about MongoDB, NoSQL database, how to create collections, and then I will be discussing some applications using MongoDB. So this is what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? So what do you mean by generalization? So far I just gave you some introduction to ER diagram, how to draw some ER diagrams. So next I am going to discuss with you about generalization and aggregation. So what do you mean by generalization? So the ER model, it has the power of expressing database entities in a hierarchical manner. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this generalization? For example, entities can be clubbed together to represent a more generalized view. For example, a particular student, he can be generalized along with all the students. So the entity can be a student and further the student is a person. Generalization. So what do you mean by generalization? So similar group of entities can be generalized into a common that is entity called person. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this? So it is the important term. So whenever I am drawing any kind of entity relationship diagram, so what are the different entities and how they are being related to each other? So all these are the important terms you should understand. So it generalizes the view of entities. So we go deep into the hierarchy. So it gives every entity included. For example, going up the structure, it is called as generalization. So how I'm going to group together or club together to represent a more generalized view. For example, an entity can be a student and further the student is a person. So all the different types of students, they can be clubbed into a single entity called student. And the opposite of generalization, it is called as a specialization. Clear with this? So what do you mean by, so I am going to discuss with you about these terms in detail. So I am just giving you a brief introduction. What do you mean by a generalization and what do you mean by specialization? So the process of generalizing entities. So the generalized entities, they contain the properties of all the generalized entities. It is called as generalization. So the number of entities are brought together into one generalized entity based on their similar characteristics. For example, I have different types of birds, pigeon, sparrow, crow, dove. So all they can be generalized into a common entity called birds. So based on their characteristics. Similarly, I have different types of animals, dog, cat, so lion, tiger. So everything can be generalized into a common entity called animal. So from this, I can derive all these things. They are sharing some common features. So generalized entity, so a number of entities, this is the correct definition of generalization. So a number of entities are brought together into one generalized entity based on their similar characteristics. So similar group of entities, entities having similar characteristics can be grouped into one entity, common entity. So from that I can derive all these things. So from this picture you can just understand what do you mean by generalization. For example, all these are the different types of birds. So I have pigeon, sparrow, dove. So all these can be grouped into a common entity called birds. So they all share the similar characteristics. So this is what is called as generalization. And what do you mean by specialization? So what do you mean by this specialization? So it is the opposite of generalization. A group of entities is divided into subgroups based on their characteristics. So the opposite. So what do you mean by generalization? So I'm going to group together that is people having similar characteristics into common entities. So this is called as generalization, and the reverse of generalization is called as the specialization. So what do you mean by this specialization? A group of entities is divided into subgroups based on their characteristics. For example, I am having a group person. So person has name, date of birth, gender. So they are common in all the persons. Whenever I am going to consider any human being, so he is going to have some name, date of birth, gender. So whereas in a company, you can consider a person can be identified as an employee, employer, customer, vendor based on the role they play. This is called as specialization, the opposite of generalization. So in case of generalization, for example, that is students, all these are generalized into entities having similar characteristics or grouped into a common entity. Whereas here you can see here specialization. A person is a common entity. So from this I am deriving some subgroups based on their characteristics. In a company, a person can be identified as an employee. He can be an employer, a customer, vendor. Specialization. So based on what role they play, so I can have different type of persons. Similarly, in an academic institution, a person can be a student, a teacher. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this generalization and what do you mean by this specialization? For example, I have different type of people. So person is a student and he is a teacher. So a person can be a student or he can be a teacher. So this is called as specialization. A specialized type of person. So he can be a student or he can be a teacher. So similarly, in a school database, persons can be specialized as teacher, student, staff. So based on what role they play in school as entities. Clear with this? So what do you mean by generalization? So based on the role they play, they can be specialized. For example, a person can be specialized as a teacher, a student, a staff. So based on what role they play in school as entities. So clear with all these concepts. So whenever I am going to draw any entity relationship diagram, so all these are the important terms you should understand. What do you mean by a generalization and what do you mean by specialization? So next I am going to discuss with you about inheritance concept. So what do you mean by inheritance? So all the above features, so far I gave you some introduction to generalization, specialization. So all the features of the ER model can be combined in order to create classes of objects in object-oriented programming. So the details of entities are generally hidden from the user. This process is known as abstraction. So what do you mean by this inheritance? It allows the lower level entities to inherit the attributes of the higher level entities. So this concept is called as the inheritance concept. For example, I am having the person. So he can have some name, age, gender. Clear with this? For example, a person is a student or he can be a teacher. So whenever I have any person, so this is an example of this inheritance concept. So a person, whenever I am going to consider any person, so each and every person he is going to have some name. So all these are the different types of attributes. So whenever I am going to have some person, so he is going to have some name, age and gender. So a person can be a student or he can be a teacher. So each and every student he is going to have some name, age. So this can be a common class and all these two are called as inherited class. So roll number and employee ID. So they share all these features. For example, a student class, it can inherit a person class. So this is called as a parent class and this is a child class. So what is the relationship? So it is represented by this inverted triangle. So a student, he is going to inherit the person class and teacher is going to inherit the person class. So all these are the common characteristics of any type of person. For example, a person can be, each and every person, he can have a name, age, gender. So whereas a student, he can have a roll number, a teacher can have an employee ID. So all these are the common characteristics. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this inheritance? So the attributes of a person class can be inherited by lower level entities such as student or teacher. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? So far I just gave you some introduction to ER rules. And then I discussed with you about what do you mean by generalization and what do you mean by specialization. So next I am going to discuss with you about Codd's rules. So what do you mean by this Codd's rules? So a person called Edgar Codd, so he has done some extensive research on relational model of RDBMS, as I was telling you, right? So whenever everything is becoming online, so whenever I want to store something in my database, I am going to use the relational model of database systems. So RDBMS concept. So they came up with 12 rules of his own. According to him, a database must obey in order to be regarded as a true relational database. So whenever I'm going to develop any RDBMS, so all these are the different rules. So he has done some research and he came up with his own result. So I'm going to discuss with you. So whenever I'm going to, so far I discussed how to draw any ER diagram. So what do you mean by an entity and what do you mean by an entity relationship diagram? So next I'm going to discuss with you about Codd's rules. So they can be applied on any database system. So that what do you mean by this? They manage the stored data using its relational capabilities. So it is a foundation rule. It acts as a base for all the other rules. So whenever I'm going to store some data in a RDBMS system, so all these are the different rules it should follow. Clear with this? So I'm going to discuss with you about different types of Codd's rules. So what are the different rules he developed? So there are 12 rules totally. So this is rule number 1. So the first one is called as an information rule. So what do you mean by this information rule? So the data stored in a database, it can be a user data or metadata. It must be a value of some table cell. Clear with this? So everything in a database must be stored in a tabular format. So information. So what do you mean by data? It is nothing but facts or information stored in a database. It can be a user data or it can be a metadata. So it must be a value of some table cell. So everything in a database must be stored in a tabular format. So it can be data or metadata. It must be a value of some table cell. So data, information rule. So everything should be stored in the form of tables. This is rule number 1. And the next rule is the guaranteed access rule. So what do you mean by this guaranteed access rule? So from the name you can just understand information rule. So data. So it should be stored in tables. So next one is guaranteed access rule. So the access, it should be accessible logically with a combination of table name, primary key and attribute name. So whenever I have some tables, whenever I'm going to store some data, so it should have some table name. So and I have some constraints, primary key constraints, or I was discussing, right, what are all the different types of keys and attributes. So it should have some column value. So no other means such as pointers, it can be used to access the data. So guaranteed access rule. So every single data element is guaranteed to be accessible logically with a combination of table name, primary key and attribute name. So this is my second rule. So whenever I'm going to store some data inside my tables, that is database, so all these are the different rules it should follow. So in order to store data, so far I was discussing, right, whenever I want to establish some relationship, so RDBMS, when I'm going to draw entity relationship diagram, so only if it follows all these rules, data can be stored effectively in a database. So second type of rule is called as a guaranteed access rule. So third rule is the systematic treatment of null values. So all these are the different rules it should follow. So what do you mean by this systematic treatment of null values? The null values in a database, it must be given a systematic and uniform treatment. Clear with this? So it is a very important rule because a null can be interpreted as one of the following. Data is missing, data is not known, data is not applicable. So systematic treatment of null values. So it is one important rule. So whenever I am storing some data, so whenever there are null values, how I am going to treat them? Data is missing. So null can be interpreted as one of the following. So data is not known or data is not applicable. Systematic treatment of null values. So important term. So whenever I am going to store any values, for example, I am collecting some employee records. Suddenly one employee is leaving. So if I am going to delete some records or if I want to change the department, one employee has shifted to a different department. So there is a null value. So if I want to treat them, so systematic treatment of null values. So this is one important rule. So null can be interpreted. So whenever there is some null value, so how I'm going to treat them? So data is missing, data is not known or data is not applicable. And the fourth important rule is the active online catalog. So what do you mean by this active online catalog? The structured description of the entire database, it must be stored in an online catalog. It is known as data dictionary. Clear with this? So the entire database, whenever I am developing, as I was telling you, right, there are different tables. So what are all the different entries that are present in the table? The structured description of the entire database, it must be stored in an online catalog. It is known as data dictionary. It can be accessed by authorized users. So users can use the same query language to access the catalog. So they can use to access the database itself. So whenever I am going to interact with the database, so I should consider the query language, structured query language. Clear with this? So I should have some catalog. So users can use the query language to access the catalog which they use to access the database. The structured description of the entire catalog. For example, whenever I am developing any database, so what are the different tables that are present? And how many entries are present in each and every table? What are all the different attributes or columns? So how they are being related to each other? So I require an active online catalog. Clear with this? So what are all the different rules? So whenever I am going to store anything in my database, so all these are the different rules it should follow. So with this I am just stopping today. I discussed with you about 4 rules. Remaining things we will see tomorrow. If you have any doubts, you can just ask me. I hope I am clear with my topics. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program, DBMS-MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, You will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving a internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. Any doubts? So today I just started with ER model concepts, and then I discussed with you about generalization and specialization, and then I started with Codd's rules. So any doubts in today's topic, whatever I discussed? I hope I'm clear with my topics. Any doubts? I hope I'm clear with my topics. Any doubts in today's topic? Yes, what is your doubt? Everything is clear? Any more doubts? Yes, Tanushka, what is your doubt? All right then. Remaining things we will see tomorrow. Same time, same link. Thank you all.